The senator from New York.
First, let me thank my colleague from Illinois for his remarks on the funding issue. I couldn't agree more. Now, there's no question that this body should be working to help curb opioid abuse in this country, to improve mental health services, to improve the way we treat addiction and speed recovery. Everyone in this chamber knows it. But the bill before us, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, is woefully insufficient for dealing with the opioid and heroin crisis. It makes a whole lot of changes, but it doesn't support a single one with any new resources. It would authorize block grants to states to treat people who are hooked on these dangerously addictive prescription painkillers, but it doesn't provide any actual money to give. It would authorize programs to help law enforcement crack down on this scourge, but it doesn't provide a single plug nickel to our cops. Without actual appropriations, this bill is like a Hollywood movie set, something that appears real on the surface, but has no substance and no life behind its facade. Let me say that again. Without actual appropriations, my colleagues, this bill is like a Hollywood movie set, something that appears real on the surface, but has no substance and no life beyond its false facade. Now, I want to clear one thing up. I've heard many of my Republican colleagues say that we should pass this bill and we can just fill in the money later. Well, forgive me for being skeptical that they will actually follow through on that promise, because my friends on the other side of the aisle have been fighting for years to cut, not increase, to cut the exact same programs they're now touting in this bill. What a sham! With the rise of the Tea Party, the hard-right conservative factions in the House and Senate brought devastating proposed cuts to the health programs that combat the opioid problem. And my colleagues here who are not members of the Tea Party went along. Now that there's an opioid crisis, now that some are worried about re-election, oh, they're out there. Where were they last year and the year before? Where are they going to be this year in terms of actually getting some funding? Last year, Republicans proposed billions of dollars of cuts to the labor HHS appropriations bill, the main funding source for substance abuse treatment. Without the bipartisan budget agreement, this would have cut $9 billion. In fact, the Senate Appropriations Committee proposed cutting the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Agency, SAMHSA, by $160 million before Democrats pushed to restore it. We didn't hear much of an outcry from the very same people who are out there saying they're doing things on opioids. And over on the other side of the Capitol, the Tea Party Republicans have gone even further. In 2012, they proposed cutting SAMHSA by $283 million. And the latest Paul Ryan budgets, the holy grail of Republican fiscal austerity, took a meat cleaver to this agency. He proposed cutting an estimated $400 million from SAMHSA in 2013 and 2014. So, the Republican record on actually fighting these programs is frankly abysmal. When you hear treatment centers, when you hear law enforcement say we don't have the resources to do what we need to go after the opioid crisis, ask yourself why. Because our colleagues on the other side of the aisle have fought increases in funding. You can't have an additional counselor. I've held parents in my arms who said my son or daughter didn't make it as they were waiting in line for treatment, but there were not enough counselors, not enough slots. I've talked to law enforcement officials who say they want to do much more, but their hands are tied because they don't have enough cops, enough intelligence, enough follow-through on going after these evil drug dealers who are just despicable. So, we want to say to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, what they probably would have done to us is block this bill. We should have no accomplishments. That's what happened in 2013 and 14. We're not going to do that. This has a few good things, but it's not close to enough. And the way the appropriations process has proceeded this session, I see no reason to believe how any of this is going to change. So far, the majority has been utterly unable to pass bills that contain increases in funding. Why? Why would good people here who say they want to fight opioids and come home and talk about it, why won't they do it? I'll tell you why. Because the hard right has a stranglehold. They say no increase in funding for anything, except maybe defense, and even a lot of the hard right people don't want that. And everyone goes along. They're afraid of the Koch brothers who want to cut. They're afraid of the Heritage Foundation that wants to cut. And so they give speeches, and they even pass a bill that makes some small improvements. But they don't give the funding. It's not that they're malicious, but they don't have the courage and strength to stand up and do what's needed. And then they're hypocritical when they go back and say they're leading the fight to go after opioid addiction. That's the problem here. So, after years of opposing funding for mental health and substance abuse programs, no one should believe that Republicans are going to honor their promises about CARA. Yeah, down the road we'll find some funding until we see it. So, Mr. President, shortly the Senate will pass this bill. As soon as that happens, Republican senators are going to run home to tout its passage as if they have single-handedly solved the opioid crisis in this country, but that won't be true. They won't mention that the bill has no funding, doesn't have the teeth it needs. They won't tell people it doesn't include a dime for a new treatment bed, $1 for a drug counselor's salary, the needed increases in money for law enforcement. What it says is this, that colleagues on the other side of the aisle are more interested in showing voters they're doing something about opioids than actually doing something, because they're constricted by a small, narrow, but powerful group of special interests in their party that say you can't vote for any increases in funding for anything. It's a shame. This is an issue ripe for bipartisan compromise. It's an issue in which we can and must make real progress. But as it stands, this bill doesn't get the job done. Mr. President, every day, 2,500 teenagers in America abuse prescription drugs for the first time. These are our kids, our neighbors, our friends. We all know families that have had the anguish, the joy that some have had as their sons and daughters have recovered. But everyone knows people who have been fighting addiction, whether it's alcohol or prescription drug abuse or others. Every day is a struggle and a fight. You're never sure. You're never sure they won't go back. And then those who have lost kids. Their kids are sometimes just out on the streets. They don't know where they are. And some of them, of course, are gone. It's nothing we should be playing games with. It's nothing we should be letting a small group of hard right ideologues block change in America. We don't need a bill designed for campaign rhetoric. We need resources. I strongly urge my Republican colleagues to schedule a vote on legislation that provides robust funding to address the opioid and heroin epidemic as soon as possible. Until we pass the increase in resources for law enforcement and treatment, both of which are so necessary, we cannot say that Congress has done what is necessary to solve and fight the opioid crisis. Mr. President, I ask consent that any time spent in quorum calls prior to 11 a.m. be equally divided.
Without objection.
Thank you. Well, I was just so disappointed to see the President-elect nominate Congressman Price to serve as Secretary of Health and Human Services this morning. When it comes to issues like Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, and Planned Parenthood, Congressman Price and the average American couldn't be further apart. Between this nomination of an avowed Medicare opponent and Republicans here in Washington threatening to privatize Medicare, it's clear that Washington Republicans are plotting a war on seniors next year. Every senior, every American, should hear this loudly and clearly. Democrats will not let them win that fight. After the 2004 elections, Republicans tried to take the rug out from under our seniors to privatize Social Security. And now, after the 2016 elections, it seems they're intent on trying the same trick on Medicare. Just as their efforts failed then, they will fail now. We say to our Republicans who want to privatize Medicare, go try it. Make our day. Democrats from blue states, purple states, red states are going to link arm in arm to protect Medicare for our seniors and ensure that Republicans don't succeed in putting our seniors' health care at risk. As we have said many times, there will be issues where we can work with the President-elect and his party. But privatizing Medicare is not, certainly not, one of those issues. We're going to fight tooth and nail any attempt to privatize, voucherize, or any other eyes you can think of when it comes to Medicare. To Republicans considering going down this path, my advice is simple. Turn back.
Mr. President.
Senator from New York.
Well, it is such a pleasure and honor to rise to recognize a great son of Scranton, sitting next to me, another son of Scranton, a grandson of Ireland, sitting in this chamber, many grandchildren of Ireland, and a Syracuse University graduate. How many others in the room can say that? But more importantly than any of those, one of the most dedicated public servants, one of the most successful public servants I've ever had the pleasure to serve with during my time in Washington. Everyone knows Joe's proud of his ancestry. His ancestors came from Ireland, as many millions have. He's deeply proud of being an Irish American. Like so many others from the Emerald Isle, our Vice President inherited the gift of gab. And thank God for that, because he's used his booming voice to speak out on so many issues. We only have a little time today. I know my colleagues are eager to speak, so I'll just focus on one of the issues that Senator Biden then led the charge on and changed America. I worked with him on the assault weapons ban and the Brady Law. When he was a senator, I was congressman. We were each head of the crime committees. But maybe the thing he was proudest of was the Violence Against Women Act. It sounds like a different world, but a few decades ago, rape and domestic violence and abuse were considered in many ways lesser crimes. Crimes in which the victim was as much at fault as the perpetrator. It was disgraceful. If you were beaten, abused, sexually assaulted, you faced a hostile, skeptical criminal justice system. That got at Joe Biden and his sense of justice. And so he exploded the myths behind domestic violence. I remember hearing the speeches against sexual abuse and put together the strongest ever violence against women law on the books. Not only did the laws make women safer, it made men better. It moved our society forward. Our work on these issues is not nearly over, but there are, I am certain, literally millions of women who have avoided pain and suffering, both physical and mental, because of the courage, the steadfastness, and the brilliance, the legislative brilliance, of the then senior senator from the great state of Delaware. Now, I could go on and on. You could almost write a book on accomplishments like that, where Joe really almost single-handedly changed the world. But he was also just a great friend and leader to so many of us, and I'll conclude with one little story. I was elected to the House, to the Senate after 18 years in the House, and an issue that I wanted to get going on was college affordability. Long-serving, I had run for the Senate on the promise of making college tuition tax deductible. So I get to the Senate and introduce my bill and make my speech. Get ready to lead the way on what I thought was my issue. We've all experienced this. And a call comes from my office from Joe's chief of staff. Of course, I spoke to him. Mr. Biden's been working on this issue for 10 years. Go work on something else. That was a nice version. Of course, me and my brand new office were in a panic. I was chastened. I didn't know what to do. And I'm sitting on the floor, feeling really forlorn. Why did I even come here? I was a senior member of the House. And I feel an arm on my shoulder. And I look up. There is the revered and exalted Senator Joe Biden. He says to me, I understand you have your college tuition tax deduction bill. Go ahead. Take the issue. I know what it's like for new senators to carve their own path. How many times can any freshman say any senator, any senior senator, say that, have said they can say that to them? They can't, because he's unique. Not only is he a towering figure and a superb man, but he has a good heart, and he looks out for the members of this body. Always has, does to this day, and always will. Because I know in Joe's heart, with all his accomplishments, he's still a senator, our senator. So, Mr. President, I say to Mr. Vice President, thank you. Thank you for your heart and passion. Thank you for bringing every ounce of yourself to public service. And thank you for that lesson of humility and leadership you taught me when I first came to this chamber. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I rise today in strong support of the 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. Now, yesterday we observed Pearl Harbor Day, marked the 69th anniversary of that tragic attack on American soil. 9 years ago, our nation was attacked once again. September 11, 2001, was a day of indescribable horror, not only for New York, the city I'm proud to call home, but for the entire nation. In the minutes, hours, and days after the Twin Towers collapsed, thousands of first responders rushed to Lower Manhattan to dig through the rubble. First, they searched for survivors. We all remember the horrible, this is vivid in my mind, Mr. President, the signs people were holding. Have you seen this person? It's my husband, my wife, my child, my parent. Because no one knew where everyone was amidst the rubble. And we thought, unfortunately, we were disappointed deeply, that there were survivors amidst the rubble, and time was of the essence to find them. Then, in days later, when we realized that there weren't many survivors, there was still a great need to sadly search for the bodies of those who perished. You can imagine the anguish of families who wanted a sign, something, remains of their loved ones, and that search continued. Valiant men and women, not just from New York or New Jersey or Connecticut, but from Minnesota and Colorado and all around the country, came, firefighters, first responders, police officers, ordinary citizens, to help us in our horrible hour of need, a moment, a day, a week, a month, that I will never forget. I still look out my window of my home in Brooklyn every day when I'm home and note that those two Twin Towers are no longer there, and I think of the people I knew who were lost. A guy I played basketball with in high school, a businessman who helped me on the way up, a firefighter who dedicated his life from my neighborhood in Brooklyn, where I was raised, to helping get people to donate blood. So we think of all these people. They were resolute, they were brave, they were selfless, those who were lost, and then those who came to the rubble. Construction workers. They didn't ask if they were going to get paid. They didn't ask what the danger was to them. They were brave, they were resolute, they were selfless, as were firefighters, policemen, EMTs, and others. Amidst the chaos and the carnage, they said to themselves, "This is what I am trained for, and I will do whatever it takes to help, even if it means risking my life." Though the dust has settled and the ruins of the World Trade Center have been cleared away, the effect of the attacks are still being felt, now more than ever, by thousands of those first responders. Medical experts have determined that on September 11th and the days after, the air around Ground Zero was filled with microscopic cement and glass particles. This dust has caused thousands of first responders to develop chronic respiratory and gastrointestinal diseases. Just last week, we lost 9/11 first responder Kevin Czartoryski, an NYPD, a New York Police narcotics detective. He's the third hero to pass away in the past month from the medical complications related to the rescue effort. Back in 2006, doctors from the Mount Sinai Medical Center that my predecessor, or my former colleague, now Secretary of State, then Senator Clinton, worked so hard to bring into the picture, found that a staggering 70% of 9/11 rescue workers suffered from health problems, many of which were irreversible. And the fact is, Mr. President, right now there are people who rush to those towers who don't know that they're ill. The symptoms of these illnesses and diseases, when you get these particles in your lungs and in your gastrointestinal system, the cancers and other illnesses that develop take years and years before they can be detected. So we know that in the coming years there are going to be more heroes who will become ill, and those who are already suffering may see their conditions worsen. The 9/11 Health and Compensation Act will finally put these first responders at ease with the knowledge that they'll receive treatment for health problems related to rescuing victims of the attack and helping clear the debris from Ground Zero. The bill ensures that those at risk of illness have access to medical monitoring and that all those who get sick from exposure have a right to consistent treatment. The bill also ensures ongoing data collection and analysis for exposed populations so we can try to cure or treat in advance people who might become ill. And critically, the legislation would ensure steady funding for these vital programs so that those in treatment no longer have to wonder whether or not Congress will appropriate adequate funds to allow their treatment to continue year to year. We have appropriated funds every year. Everyone in this chamber has voted for those funds. But when it's yearly funds and you need an ongoing medical regime, it's very hard to plan, to buy that machine, to set up a team that would work for 3 or 4 or 5 years under normal circumstances. The heroes who rush to the towers deserve to be guaranteed proper treatment, not to have their medical needs subject to the whims of what's going on at that month, that time in Washington. And let me say this. In addition to addressing health needs, the bill would reopen the Victims' Compensation Fund, allowing those who missed the arbitrary deadline of December 22, 2003 to seek compensation. This deadline's unfairly barred responders who became ill or learned of the fund after the date. You rushed to the tower. As of 2003, you were aware of the fund, but you didn't apply. You didn't have anything wrong with you, and 6 months later, you get cancer of the lungs, or cancer of the esophagus or stomach, which we found so many getting. Why unfairly prevent them? So, Mr. President, this bill is an opportunity to send a clear message to the thousands of first responders who risked their lives on that fateful day 9 years ago. We say to them, in our nation's time of need, you gave us your all. Now, in your time of need, we will give you our all. Let's not forget, on both sides of the aisle, we have mightily struggled to help our veterans from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2001 and 2002, we saw that veterans' health care was not up to snuff, and there was a bipartisan effort to bring it up to snuff, to make the health care adequate for the new needs of the veterans who risked their lives for us in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why? Because this nation has a tradition. When you volunteer, as our soldiers do today, and risk your life to protect our freedom, particularly at a time of war, we will be there for you and deal with your medical problems that were caused in that conflict. I would argue to every one of my colleagues here today, those who rushed to the towers in those fateful hours and days after 9/11 are no different than our veterans who we exalt. It was a time of war. Our nation was attacked. They volunteered. No one compelled them to do it. And they rushed to danger, like our veterans do. So when they are injured, which has happened, they should be treated the same as our veterans. This is nothing we should play politics with, just like we don't play politics with veterans' needs. I want to make sure that everybody hears us. I know there's other legislative concerns, whether it's tax bills or funding bills or whatever. I would say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it is not fair and it is not right to say we will not remember these people who volunteered and risked their lives to protect our freedom in a time of war. We will not help them until X or Y or Z gets done. Not fair, not right. It is also time for those who are against this bill to stop spreading lies about it. They say it's vulnerable to fraud. It's been very tight. My good colleague, the senator from New York, Senator Gillibrand, has documented thoroughly and completely how the existing compensation has not created any fraud or other types of problems. And so, we're here. We've debated this bill for years. It's been like running a marathon, and this is the last 100 yards. Thousands of first responders, police officers, firefighters, construction workers, and other heroes who are ordinary citizens from each of the 50 states is waiting for us to act. And for all too many of them, help cannot come soon enough. The finish line is in view. Let us, on both sides of the aisle, cross it together. I implore my colleagues to vote in favor of the 9/11 Health and Compensation Act. And before I sit down, I just want to praise my colleague who has led the fight on this, Senator Gillibrand from New York. She has made it her passion. She works for it hours every day and has done an amazing, amazing job. And I also want to thank our other colleagues on this legislation, particularly my colleagues from across the river, Senators Lautenberg and Menendez, who have been our partners in this. I want to thank Peter King, Carolyn Maloney, Gerald Nadler in the House for their work, and many others in the New York and other delegations. And again, hope that those efforts will not go in vain, not because of the people who worked on the bill like we did, but because of the people who need our help, like those who have all kinds of illnesses, because they volunteered to help our great nation and preserve its freedom in a time of war. I yield the floor. Madam President, I rise to speak on a bill that you, Madam President, have spearheaded the charge for and done it with such hard work and determination and commitment and vigor, and that is the bill to provide health care for our 9/11 heroes, those men and women who at a time of war rushed to danger to save lives and protect our freedom. We have met with these brave men and women repeatedly. Some of them are suffering already with cancers they acquired for their act of bravery. Others know it is an almost certainty that they will come down with similar diseases and illnesses that are extremely costly to fight. And Madam President, we've had a grand tradition in America. Those who risk their lives to protect us and volunteer to do it under no compunction, we remember them when they get hurt in that brave endeavor. We do it for our veterans. We should be doing it for our 9/11 heroes, the first responders, the police, the firefighters, the EMT workers, the construction workers, and the ordinary citizens who rushed to danger at a time when no one knew how many people might be living and entrapped in those collapsed towers. And I would plead with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. This should not be a moment of politics. One can come up with reason after reason after reason why not to vote for this bill. And we've heard many, and the reasons keep changing. But one fact doesn't change. There are those who need help, who deserve our help, from New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and from every other state of the Union. And to them, a parliamentary decision that we can't vote on this because there's another bill we want to vote on first, because we would change this or that, are going to ring very, very hollow. This should not be a partisan issue, Madam President. This should be an issue where America unites. When it comes to helping our veterans, we are united. That is not a Democratic or Republican issue. That is not a Northeast-Southwest issue. It is an issue of being an American. This vote is about being an American. Because from the days at Bunker Hill, when the patriots put down their plows and took up muskets to defend and create our freedom, we always tried to take care of them. We've done it better and better for our veterans, and the heroes of 9/11 are no different. So I beg, I plead, I implore two brave colleagues from the other side to join us. Put aside the political considerations. Remember what these people did for us. You've seen them when they visited your offices, the suffering, all for an act of voluntary heroism. They're not asking for welfare. They are not asking for a huge handout. They're simply asking that they be able to meet the high health care costs that occur when you develop cancers and other illnesses because particles of glass and cement and other materials get lodged in your lungs or your gastrointestinal tract. So this is our last call. It's a plea. We will keep at this, but today is the day to step up to the plate. I urge my colleagues to please support those brave men and women who were there for us, for America. Do not come up with an excuse as to why not you can't do it. We have marched and marched and marched, and this is the finish line. Help us get over it, please. I yield the floor.